What happened when my parents secretly rewrote their will to leave everything to my brother because he was the real success. But instead of fighting them in court, I quietly built my own company, bought the very house they left him, and made him pay me rent to live in it. The house felt exactly the same the day I found out I'd been written out of my childhood. It still had the same brass doorknob nicked from years of eager hands, the same hallway where my father's shoes always lined up like little soldiers, the same kitchen with the faded linoleum where my mother made pancakes every Sunday. Only now, when I ran my hand along the banister, something in the grain felt like a ledger rubbing against a coin, an account closing. When I ran my hand along the banister, something in the grain felt like a ledger rubbing against a coin, an account closing, quietly, without my name on it. I should say, first, how much that house mattered, not just as real estate, though yes, it was a big old weatherboard with a wraparound porch and maple trees that had been baby saplings when my brother Daniel and I were small enough to hide behind them. The house was a map of a lifetime, a cradle mark on the dining room floor from the high chair, the scuffs where my father dragged a heavy crate into the garage, the secret cupboard where my mother once hid a letter from a suitor she never married. It was the kind of place that keeps birthdays in the wallpaper and remembers the sound of your footsteps. So when the lawyer called, calm, procedural, the tone of someone used to delivering weather reports, and asked if I could come in for a quick estate matter, I drove over expecting, in some naive way, to be part of the ordinary paperwork that accompanies any family transition. The kind of meeting where you make polite small talk and sign a few forms where the words administer and estate have little to do with the people they concern. The will sat on the mahogany table like a small, soft bomb. The lawyer cleared his throat and read the line with the same deliberate care he used for all the other clauses, until he hit the part where everything in the house, the property, the business interests my parents held, even the small trust that paid for Aunt Rose's care, was left to my brother, not shared in any way, not in equal measure, nothing, everything. For the phrase, the real success, the lawyer had no tone of irony. He simply presented it as fact, as if the words had already been lived. My parents were there. My mother's eyes were ringed with that sleep-born shine people get when grief has had its quiet way with them for weeks. My father was his usual composed self, but his fingers had the tremor of a man trying to steady a voice he no longer trusted inside his chest. When I finally had the courage to ask why, to ask whether this was a mistake or some misunderstanding, my mother swallowed and said a sentence I'd been waiting to hear my whole life, and it landed like cold water. Your father and I have decided Daniel is better equipped to manage the house and family affairs. He's settled, successful, and, frankly, the one we trust to carry the name forward. We want stability. There it was, the betrayal sweetened by the word stability. They called my brother the real success in passing as if it were a small, harmless observation. He'd accepted a position in corporate finance 3 years ago, married a woman who loved country clubs, and bought a new car that he thought was a joke when he first saw it. From their perspective, success meant steady paychecks and a tidy investment portfolio. From mine, it meant something else entirely, a history, a community, a father's hand on a machine that hummed on overtime. I didn't scream. I don't know if that makes me better or just quieter. I sat there and listened to the lawyer explain clauses about trustees and reversion rights, about contingencies that made the house legally unassailable, unless I challenged the will in court. Naturally, there were options. The lawyer, being a professional, mentioned them in a voice that was almost apologetically practical. Challenge it, spend a fortune in legal fees, make the whole story ugly in public, or accept it. Walk away as if the removal were a simple pruning, and try to keep some kind of relationship with the people who just closed a door on you. My parents looked at me like people who had punished me because they loved me. My father's voice, when it came, had a confession in it that almost made me thankful. We thought we were doing the right thing, he said. We didn't want you to carry the burden of this when you had your path. Burden. We thought we were doing the right thing, he said. We didn't want you to carry the burden of this when you had your path. Burden. The word landed like an accusation. It implied I was unfit, unreliable, too scattered. It implied that stewardship required a certain kind of life, one I didn't live because I'd chosen different risks. Daniel's life was tidy. Mine was not. I owned 2 small rental apartments, a car I paid off in monthly bites, and, most recently, a freelance business that paid unevenly but gave me room to breathe. My parents, to their credit, had always encouraged me to take creative risks. They'd also, in private rooms, favored the solidity of someone who could pull down a pension and live in a house with landscapers on Wednesdays. I went home that evening with the will's last paragraph replaying in my head, and somehow the house felt like an inventory list of what I had been denied. Rooms full of memories that now belonged to someone whose idea of inheritance began with fiscal neatness. My mother called me later that night, the tremor gone, replaced by an anxious apology. We wanted to make a clean choice, she said. We didn't want the family to be split by arguments. I wanted to ask one question. Did they ever consider how a secret rewrite felt? To be told you were no longer counted as the family's custodian? But I didn't ask it. I had already heard the answer. My instinct at first was to explode. Go public. Challenge the will on grounds of undue influence or mental capacity. Drag my brother and my parents through a public charade that would leave them uncomfortable, maybe even bankrupt the estate with legal fees. There's a small, savage satisfaction in imagining a courtroom meltdown that exposes hypocrisy, affidavits, testimony, under-the-table payments. But I am not a good vandal of family. I could picture my mother's face changing in ways that wouldn't be undone by truth. I could also see how a drawn-out fight would burn the house to ash. Legal wins can be Pyrrhic. So, in a way that felt like both defeat and strategy, I walked away. Not gracefully. There was a coldness in my tone that surprised me, but I left a private life in which the inheritance was a thing that had been stolen stolen, and began to think of it as something I would rebuild. If I wasn't going to take it from them in court, how would I get it back? That question became a pivot point. I could have tried to cultivate my parents' respect by buying 2 suits and a bank account stuffed with stocks. I could have climbed the ladder and become the stable sort they admired. Instead, I chose the thing people often do when they are hurt and practical. I decided to make my own money, on my own terms, quietly, so that there would be a day when the house could be purchased from my brother or the trustees without me appearing desperate or vengeful. There was a kind of small arithmetic to it. Real estate can change hands in many ways. Houses can be bought, mortgage transferred, or acquired by private purchase. Daniel might love the house now, but people get tired, life's tides shift, and the thing that always makes people move is money. If I built something solid, something tidy and reliable, I could create a new way of claiming the house, not by familial permission, but by transaction. The idea isn't elegant, it's squinting practicality. Build capital, buy the asset, make the terms. So I began small and very deliberately. I drew plans in a notebook at the kitchen table, a company that could scale, get revenue predictable, and one day afford to buy an old weatherboard with maples. I could have tried to build the kind of business that lines up with the conventional definitions of success, enterprise software, maybe, or investment funds. But I don't code. I don't like the sterile glare of VC pipelines. I am good at things that feel like repair, organizing projects, finding talented people, matching a market that needs honesty with a product that delivers it. I thought about what I knew and where a gap existed. Our town's middle slice, people who loved their houses but hated the hassle of managing renovations, renters who needed professionally managed, honest apartments, and small local businesses that needed reliable property services. All of them suffered from a patchwork array of contractors and flaky landlords. Most of the people I talked to complained about the same thing: trust. You can find a cheap contractor, or you can find a trustworthy one. The latter required time or a friend's referral. That was where I saw a wedge. If I could build a property services company, not just renovations, but maintenance, tenant placement, and a small portfolio strategy that made property ownership sane for ordinary people, then I could build cash flow, support for the apartments I already owned, and, crucially, a vehicle that could grow to buy the house. I called it, with an ironic humility, Hearth and Hammer, because I wanted the brand to sound like something that would show up with a truck and respect. The first months were staccato, phone calls, a scraped-together website that looked like something from a friend who freelanced on the side, a logo emailed to me at 1 a.m. by a designer who believed in the idea. I hired 2 contractors on short retainer, a retired carpenter named Miguel and a young project manager named Tara, who had a taste for spreadsheets and a filthy sense of humor. My plan was gritty. Take on small jobs, make them immaculate, turn customers into repeat clients, and then take the revenue and reinvest. I would document everything: profit margins, turnaround times, customer happiness. If I could prove a repeatable model, investors might come. If no investors came, the business could still scale slowly by compounding profits. At night, after small jobs and invoicing cycles, I learned the bits of corporate finance I never had: what a convertible note looked like, how to read an amortization schedule that didn't sound like a foreign language. I started a spreadsheet I guarded like a ledger and began to put the house's estimated market value in the far right column, like a distant beacon. Projected price in 5 years, 7 years, 10. It was a math of patient accumulation, not angry assault. The first 2 clients were a small victory. Mrs. Peters, whose porch had been sagging so long she'd learned to step carefully, hired us to replace rotted steps and repaint. She left a note: finally someone who shows up. The second was a landlord with 3 units who wanted to reduce vacancies. We reworked his listings, fixed small maintenance issues, and within 3 months he called to ask if we could manage the properties full-time. "You make it easy," he said. "Small revenue, repeat business." A crew that liked the work. Every payment I put into the company's account felt like a seed. I didn't broadcast any of it. I didn't go to my parents and say, "A crew that liked the work." Every payment I put into the company's account felt like a seed. I didn't broadcast any of it. I didn't go to my parents and say, "See, I'm proving a point." Quiet is a strategy. People who shout are often the ones who need their victory to be visible because they distrust the slow accrual of capital. Months passed. My parents called less frequently. At Thanksgiving, Daniel pulled me aside and said, with a half laugh, "You'll change your mind. It's easier to own nice things when someone else deals with the bills." I smiled and said nothing about compound interest or convertible notes. It would have been petty to lecture him. I let the future be patient. If this part of the story has a moral, it's this: vengeance is less satisfying than competence. When someone steals from you what you love, you can either scream about it until your voice is raw, or you can build something that makes them come to you on your terms. I chose the latter because the house, in the end, was never just a possession. It was a place where people cooked and fought and forgave and argued late at night. It deserved stewardship, not spectacle. So I built Hearth and Hammer like an oyster grows a pearl, slowly, layer by patient layer. I tracked every invoice, every customer referral. I learned to negotiate vendor contracts so the margins improved. I put profits into a separate account and watched those digits grow, not with drama, but with persistent, boring discipline. And when the house appears in my projections, 4 columns to the right, then 3, then 2, it no longer feels like an object people can hand me or withhold from me. It becomes something that can be bought with my work, with my skill, and with my refusal to be defined by someone else's idea of who I should be. That's where part 1 ends, with the old house still standing on its lot, with my parents' signatures in an envelope at the lawyer's office, and with me, late at night in a small room above a rented garage, scraping paint off a window frame that looks like a map of a life I intend to reclaim. The ledger is quiet for now. The work is loud, and the plan, slow, stubborn, and, I hope, inevitable, is finally underway. The next year moved like one of those long, honest clocks you only notice when the second hand is missing. Steady, deliberate, inevitable. The next year moved like one of those long, honest clocks you only notice when the second hand is missing. Steady, deliberate, inevitable. Hearth and Hammer stopped being a side hustle and started being a machine, less romantic, more reliable. Miguel and Tara became the backbone. Miguel's knuckles were permanently inked with paint and sawdust. Tara's spreadsheets read like prayers. We picked jobs a little smarter, not the highest margin vanity renos, but the ones that built repeat customers. Landlords who needed vacancy turned around Saturday to Monday. A small church that needed kneelers rebuilt every spring. A tiny cafe that wanted a full facelift without closing for 2 weeks. The kind of work that shows up in a bank ledger as dependable deposits. There were nights I still crawled into the back of the shop and fell asleep on a folding chair because something always needed one last invoice or one more supplier call. But there were more mornings with a calm I'd never felt before. Recurring clients sending, "Can you do me next month?" and deposit alerts pinging my phone at 8 a.m. The profit margin on small, honest jobs is boringly beautiful when you compound it month after month. I did one strategic thing that changed our trajectory. I hired Rosa, an accountant who smelled faintly of mint and had a soft way of refusing bullshit. Rosa taught me how to tell the story of Hearth and Hammer in numbers instead of feelings. She built a cash flow model that made banks stop fidgeting. When I walked into my first meeting with a community bank, I didn't bring pleading eyes. I brought spreadsheets, references, and a tidy 3-year plan that made their loan committee imagine dependable interest payments instead of another unpaid invoice. The bank approved a modest line of credit and a small-term loan targeted at businesses that manage properties. It wasn't venture capital glamour. It was the exact tool a lean property services company needs. Enough to buy a rusted-out landlord's contract, enough to replace a failing roof for a landlord who would then sign a management agreement. I used every cent wisely. We reinvested into a second used truck, an industrial-grade ladder, and training so Miguel's crew could install proper insulation instead of the slapdash patchwork that used to define cheaper contractors. There were setbacks. A subcontractor took payment and never came back. A permit inspector flagged a code issue that cost us $2,000 out of pocket to remediate. A landlord tried to stiff us on a final bill and dragged out payment for 6 weeks. Each time we were knocked sideways, Rosa and Tara made spreadsheets and phone calls until the problem was boring again. The grit of running a business is mostly tolerating tiny humiliations and fixing them before they become stories. At home, the family dynamics oscillated between brittle and strange. My parents rang for holidays with the same polite charm as before, but there was a distance, a new awkwardness in the cadence. Daniel was cordial in texts, congrats on the growth, and then polite in person. He'd bought a new SUV and posted photos of charity galas my parents attended. I saw him at Thanksgiving looking at the house like an exhibit labeled his. He assumed the house would one day be his without thinking about the labor behind it. That assumption is powerful until it isn't. Then, quietly, life shifted his way, and in one of those second-hand ironies real life loves to hand you, the shift made an opening. Daniel's job changed. A corporate reorg that looked like opportunity on a glossy memo turned into an actual slog of travel, and with travel came expenses and a temptation toward lifestyle inflation. He refinanced a car. He co-signed for a friend's startup loan. He agreed to invest in a partnership that promised high returns and delivered high phone calls and low returns. People who earn tidy salaries sometimes believe they are immune to the slow creep of cash leaks until the bank account tells the truth. One afternoon, over coffee, I learned he'd been quietly tapped by a new manager to take a lead on a cross-state initiative that included relocation pay. But the kicker was that the relocation would be contingent on clearing his current obligations. Translation: he needed to consolidate or liquidate some assets fast. The language of urgent liquidity is the same in boardrooms and kitchens. We need cash, fast. He was the sort of man who didn't want to ask his parents for help publicly. He was embarrassed to show weakness. Life does not need to be cruel to produce consequences. It only needs to be exact. When Daniel's financial stress became thinly contained, calls at odd hours, a hushed tone with my mother, I watched and waited. I didn't cheer. I didn't passively suffer either. Instead, I did the arithmetic that had become part of my reflexive landscape. Hearth and Hammer had a line of credit, a growing revenue stream, and a balance sheet that could support a mortgage if the metrics lined up. I could buy the house the old-fashioned way, a private sale. If Daniel needed cash, I could offer him a reasonable price, no lawyers screaming, no probate court theatrics. The house would stop being an instrument of family identity and become property, an asset that could be managed, stewarded, and, crucially, bought clean. But the trick was subtle. A direct hostile offer would have been a guillotine. I wanted negotiation, not confrontation. You can be the person who wins by brute force, or the person who wins by making the other side think they chose the right thing. I preferred the latter, because it preserves the people you can't afford to lose, your mother's face at Christmas, your father drinking too much on a bad phone call. So I arranged a conversation with Daniel. He came over, pockets full of anxiety. He was polite and slightly defensive. "I don't want to sell," he said, like an incantation. This was Dad's and Mom's. I thought, "It's my future. You could keep it," I said, "or you could sell it," like an incantation. This was Dad's and Mom's. I thought, "It's my future. You could keep it," I said. Or you could sell it. Or you could let someone who loves the house as much as you do manage it properly. You don't have to tell me why. I know pressure when I see it. I had rehearsed that sentence. It sounded like detached kindness. He didn't reply at first. He talked about mortgages and moving, and how he couldn't take on the risk of renegotiated taxes while relocating. I made an offer that was fair and quiet, market value minus a small discount for speed, and for the fact that we could close without a protracted sale process that would hold up his relocation. I won't lowball you, I said. I'll give you enough to cover the bridge and some cushion. He bristled. How could his sister, the one they'd loved but left out, offer to buy the house? It felt like a reversal he hadn't rehearsed. Pride is thin armor against liquidity. Pride looks like indignation until it looks like a liability. A man with a deadline chooses. Daniel chose speed. There was no dramatic falling out. There was paperwork, the kind that smells faintly of new ink and legal pads. He signed the deed over and moved his life into boxes. He left a note on the mantle, 2 sentences, private and enough, and drove away with the attitude of someone who expected to return. People leave with the idea of coming back more often than they actually do. Legally, the purchase was clean. I used a combination of business earnings, a small private investor who believed in our mission, Sam who ran a local bakery and had been one of our first clients, and a mortgage in my company's name structured as a purchase of residential property by an LLC owned by Hearth & Hammer. It wasn't romantic. It was clever and practical. The house became an asset on our books and a flagship of our property management model. Heritage property, maintained for the long term, open to community events, and also rentable. Here's the delicious part, at least for someone who likes irony in small doses. Daniel asked if he could stay. He had nowhere else set up. He was temporarily relocating for work and didn't want strangers in his childhood rooms. I didn't have to make a decision in the heat of family. I'd planned for this. Hearth & Hammer offered him a month-to-month tenancy at market rent, below what the market demanded for that neighborhood, but still fair, and an opportunity to retain the sentimental part of the house while he sorted his life out. He agreed. He moved back in as a tenant. He was used to being the inheritor, the person who expected a family to preserve and defer. Now he was a renter paying my company's bank account for the privilege of living in the house he'd assumed would be his by default. The dinner conversations were strange and careful. He sat with the same polite anger as before, but now it had a practical cadence. Would you mind if I stored a box in the attic? Please keep the noise down when you're on calls, I would reply. The roles were reversed in ways that didn't need to be shouted, just lived. My parents called less, then more cautiously. My mother came to see the house clean and shining for the first time in years and said softly, "You've done something good." My father grunted his approval in a way that, in private, meant a lot more than he could say publicly. There were awkward family dinners. Daniel's wife, whose smile never reached her eyes when the water glass was full, tried to be congenial. And there were quieter moments that belonged to me alone. Watering the maple tree at sunset and thinking about how the scuff on the banister now told a different story. Owning the house didn't end the grief. It complicated into something practical. I had to deal with maintenance, with old pipes, with zoning questions and neighbor complaints about a rickety fence. I had to be legal and generous at the same time. I set up a small clause in the rental agreement. If Daniel agreed to a 6-month sublease window where he kept the house tidy and paid market rent, I'd ensure he had first right of refusal to rebuy if he came market rent. I'd ensure he had first right of refusal to rebuy if he came market rent. I'd ensure he had first right of refusal to rebuy if he came back financially stable. It was a way of preserving dignity. The house was not a trophy to be wielded, but an asset stewarded. People asked whether it felt petty to charge my brother rent in the house our parents wrote me out of. I'd ask them this: what would you have done? Walk into the living room and beg for what was never offered? Drag the family into court and win by tearing the fabric? There are many ethical ways to reclaim something. I chose the one that left the house intact and gave me the power to decide its future. Hearth & Hammer continued to grow. The house became our proof. Our portfolio spoke in square footage and in tenant satisfaction ratings. We sponsored neighborhood cleanups, donated a summer camp scholarship for a kid from the block, and ran free how to fix a leaking faucet classes in the basement. The house no longer felt like a prize reserved for a single heir. It became a hub. There were awkward moments. Daniel paying me by check, then by direct deposit. The quiet efficiency of transfers that replaced the old entitlement with an uncomfortable modernity. Once, at a family dinner, he stood up to make a toast to home and tripped over the phrase. Mom cried a little and squeezed my hand under the table. I didn't gloat. I never had the taste for pyrotechnics. The quiet, steady destiny of the house was, ironically, a better revenge than spectacle. Buying the house didn't heal every wound. It didn't make my parents' decision less wounding. It didn't fix a childhood of feeling second. But it did something else. It moved the power from a paternal pronouncement to a practical, accountable place. I made a ledger where there had been a secret sentence in an envelope. I turned absence into ownership by doing the unsexy work, building a business, negotiating responsibly, documenting every invoice. And then, when the chance came, I bought what mattered. People call it poetic sometimes. Sister buys family home. But poetry doesn't mend pipes or pay property tax. The real magic is less public and more useful. The house was warm. The rent checks landed on time. The maple tree grew another ring. And the people who lived there slept better knowing someone was looking after their roof. That was enough. Part 2 closes with a quiet scene. A late autumn evening, 2 lamps glowing in the front bay, me turning the key in the old brass knob and standing on the porch watching heat fog the windows from inside. Daniel was in the kitchen making coffee, muttering about schedules. My mother was inside humming a song from her youth. The house was mine by deed and by duty. And for the first time in a long time, the banister felt like something I'd earned rather than something I'd been denied. Winter brought with it a kind of stillness I hadn't known since childhood. The old maple trees outside the house were bare again, the ground hardened with frost. The porch creaked under the weight of snow. For the first time since I signed the papers, I felt the gravity of what it meant to own, not just the house, but the past. Daniel still lived there, month to month, as a tenant. Each time his rent transferred into the Hearth and Hammer account, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and grief. Satisfaction, because the irony was undeniable. My brother, once crowned the real success, now writing checks to live in a house my parents had stolen from me, and I had quietly reclaimed. Grief, because the family dinners had grown colder. My parents spoke to him with guilt in their voices, but they never admitted they had chosen wrong. They loved him still, but it was me they turned to now when the roof leaked, when the foundation cracked, when the taxes came due. They had, unintentionally, placed the burden on the child they deemed unfit to carry it. Running Hearth and Hammer gave me clarity. What my parents had called a burden was, in truth, responsibility. And responsibility is nothing more than systems, discipline, and care, repeated long enough to outlast laziness and entitlement. Our company doubled its client base that winter. Landlords referred other landlords, tenants recommended us to friends, and small businesses signed management contracts after we proved we could keep their buildings humming. We weren't flashy, we were boring, consistent, reliable, and in property, boring wins. One morning, Rosa slid a report across my desk. "You're in position," she said. "Cash flow strong, debt service coverage more than healthy. You could expand." She meant a second property purchase, not just the house, but an entire block of duplexes on the south side that had been in limbo after their owner declared bankruptcy. The city wanted them rehabilitated, investors were circling, but Hearth and Hammer had something others didn't, trust from the neighborhood. I went after it. The negotiations dragged for weeks, but in the end, the bankruptcy trustee agreed to a sale if we promised to keep tenants housed and bring the buildings up to code. We signed the deal. Suddenly, Hearth and Hammer wasn't just a scrappy service firm, it was a property owner with a small but solid portfolio. That's when the calls started. Investors, bankers, even my parents. Word spread fast that I was no longer the unreliable dreamer, but the owner of multiple properties and the operator of a profitable business. My father called late one night, his voice quiet. "Your mother and I, we might have made a mistake," he said. "We wanted stability, but I see now you built it your way." It wasn't an apology. It was as close as he could get. Daniel's pride, meanwhile, cracked under the weight of circumstance. His relocation didn't pan out. The big promotion evaporated in another corporate shuffle. His investments bled. He fell behind on credit card payments. One night, as I was locking up after a late meeting, I found him sitting on the porch steps, shoulders slumped. "I need more time with the rent," he muttered. I studied him in silence. Here was the brother who had been handed everything, who had been chosen as the heir, who had smiled smugly at Thanksgiving while I sat there with nothing. Now he was asking me, the sibling written out of the will, for grace. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind him of the words, "the real success." I told him the truth. "You can stay if you pay. If you can't, I'll help you find something smaller. But this house isn't free anymore. It costs to keep it standing. It always did." He looked at me with shame, then nodded. "I'll pay." And he did, barely, scraping together enough to cover each month. But the power dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the heir anymore. He was a tenant, and I was no longer the cast-off child, but the steward. The final irony came that spring, when the local paper ran a feature on neighborhood revitalization. Hearth and Hammer's name was front and center. They photographed me standing on the porch of the house, the maple trees budding behind me. The headline read, "Building Back Home, How One Local Company is Restoring Trust and Property." My parents clipped the article. Daniel saw it framed on the wall of the cafe downtown. For the first time, I think they understood. Legacy isn't about who's written into a will. It's about who shows up every day, pays the bills, keeps the lights on, and makes sure the house, literal or metaphorical, doesn't collapse. That was the day I stopped feeling like I'd taken something back. I realized I had built something new. And the house no longer belonged to a name on a document. It belonged to me because I'd earned it, because I'd paid for it with years of quiet labor. Daniel still paid me rent. My parents still lived with the regret of their decision. And I, for the first time in my life, slept soundly in the knowledge that I didn't need their validation anymore. The banister felt smooth under my hand again, not because it reclaimed it, not as inheritance, but as proof of work. Spring blurred into summer, and by then the house didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like infrastructure, an asset in my portfolio, a symbol for Hearth and Hammer, and yes, a home again. We hosted barbecues in the backyard with our crew and clients. We opened the porch for a neighborhood block party. The maple trees shaded kids running in the grass. The very place that had once been the weapon my parents used to define me had become the banner under which I defined myself. But for Daniel, the walls were closing in. His relocation had failed. His corporate role got downsized to something that sounded impressive on paper, but came with less pay. The investments he'd bragged about, the startup loan, the speculative real estate fund, all dried up. Debt collectors started calling him at the house, though they didn't know the irony. The house wasn't his anymore. He fell behind on rent again. This time, weeks passed without payment. Rosa showed me the ledger one afternoon, her brow furrowed. "You've been more than generous," she said. "If you were anyone else, you'd have filed notice already." She was right. Hearth and Hammer wasn't a charity. If I let sentiment decide, the company would suffer. But it was more than business. This was my brother, the boy who once climbed those maples with me, the man who'd been handed everything and still managed to drop it. So I called him into the kitchen, the same one where our mother had served us pancakes on Sundays. The counters were spotless now, the stove polished. Tara's idea, keeping the rental market ready. "Daniel," I said, as gently as I could, "we can't keep doing this. You're behind again." He looked exhausted, thinner than I'd ever seen him. "I just need time," he said. "I'm drowning. I slid the paper across the counter. It was a formal notice, the same template we used for every tenant. I just need time, he said. I'm drowning. I slid the paper across the counter. It was a formal notice, the same template we used for every tenant. Neutral, firm, professional. You have 30 days to pay or vacate. His face crumpled. You'd evict your own brother? I held his gaze. No, you did that to yourself. I'm just writing it down. He stormed out. A week later, he left the house. My parents called, furious, accusing me of cruelty. He's your brother, my mother cried. No, I said softly. He was your heir. You chose him. I just gave him the same terms I give everyone else. That's fairness. Silence. Then my father's voice, brittle. Maybe we were wrong. The house was empty for the first time in decades. I walked through it alone, hearing echoes of childhood laughter, fights, birthdays, slammed doors. It was melancholy and liberating all at once. Then, true to the hearth and hammer model, I listed it. Within a week, a young family signed a lease. They moved in with boxes, toys, and a golden retriever who loved the backyard. The house was alive again, not as a shrine to bloodline, but as a living, breathing home for people who valued it. That Christmas, my parents finally came to me, not with anger, but with humility. My mother touched my hand across the table. We made a mistake, she whispered. My father nodded, eyes glassy. We thought legacy was about who we trusted to inherit, but it's about who proves they can carry it. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind them of the lawyer's words, of the real success. I simply said, you taught me to work hard. I just took that lesson further than you expected. In that moment, I let go of the need for revenge. They had already sentenced themselves with regret. Daniel had already written his own downfall. The house, the business, the legacy. It was mine now, not by gift, not by favoritism, but by proof. Years later, people in town still point to the house when they talk about Hearth and Hammer. They say, that's where it all started. They don't mention wills or betrayals. They mention the block parties, the repairs, the families who came and went under its roof. And that, I realized, was the ultimate victory. Not making my brother suffer, not shaming my parents, but turning what was once withheld from me into something bigger than all of us. Because inheritance isn't about who your parents choose. It's about what you choose to build. And I built something that outlived their mistakes.